Hello, this is another one of my videos on WW2 Parker's short introduction to the Second World War. It's the second video on Parker's Chapter 14, The Defeat of Japan and the Atom Bomb. In the previous video, we noted the devastating impact of the two great naval battles in 1944, the Battle of the Philippines in June and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October. After the second battle, as Parker notes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been crippled by its lack of fuel and was now suffering from a demoralizing inactivity. However, whilst the Americans had achieved air and naval superiority in the Pacific, they still had to face determined resistance from Japanese ground forces scattered across the various island chains and equipped at key locations with ample stocks of food and munitions. Japanese troops had been carefully instilled with the traditional warrior doctrine that it was better to die than to surrender, an indoctrination made easier by the close-knit, isolated, and homogeneous nature of Japanese society. Not only was this a matter of honor and belief for the Japanese, but the troops were told by their officers that the Americans would torture and kill them if they were captured, and that even if they survived, then they would have committed a crime punishable by death. There were thus suicide charges of cornered Japanese troops against the Americans and their allies, as well as instances of Japanese officers beheading their own troops to spare them the dishonor of capture, and hundreds of civilian auxiliaries and their families committing suicide at the moment of defeat. Responding to instances of such behavior, and reinforced by both racial prejudice and by generally true accounts of Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners of war, the American soldiers and Marines were less inclined to accept Japanese surrenders, even when these were made. The result was a particularly vicious series of encounters between the advancing Americans and the ensconced Japanese, leading to heavy casualties among the Americans and the death of the majority of Japanese defenders. Responding to this reality, the Americans deliberately bypassed many Japanese bases and occupied islands, sure of their own superior mobility and success in amphibious landings, and the increasing isolation of the Japanese garrisons that they bypassed. Steady progress was made in the Central Pacific under Admiral Nimitz, with Americans capturing key islands in the Gilberts in November 43, the Marshalls in January and February 44, the Marianas in June-July 44, the Carolines in September-October 44, whilst at the same time General MacArthur's forces moved into the Bismarck archipelago northeast of New Guinea in January to March 1944, and then in a series of amphibious landings along the northern coast of New Guinea and on to Molokai in the Malacca Islands. Next, the two strands of American advance combined to attack Leyte in the Philippines in October 44, after which MacArthur attacked Mindoro and Luzon from December 44 to January 45, securing first-class bases for further advance, despite Japanese troops holding out in some parts of Luzon until the war's end. The American Marines landed on the remote Japanese island of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945. Strategically important, the island is 1,200 kilometers, that's 750 miles, south of Tokyo, and so an ideal base for both fighters and bombers in the coming battle for the home islands. Fiercely defended and very well fortified, the tiny island, 5 miles long by 2.5 miles wide, that's 21 square kilometers in area, took 6 weeks to conquer, despite the heaviest naval bombardment of the war prior to the landing. The Americans took 26,000 casualties, 6,812 dead, the rest injured, about 1/3 of their number, whilst the Japanese garrison of almost 21,000 were almost all killed or took their own lives. There were only 216 prisoners. Next came the Ryukyu Islands, between the southernmost of Japan's home islands and Taiwan, particularly Okinawa, the largest island, and intended as the main forward base for the upcoming attack on the Japanese home islands. The conflict on Okinawa lasted almost 3 months, from April through to June 1945, and was even more fiercely contested than Iwo Jima. The American invasion force eventually numbered 190,000 men against 77,000 defenders. Losses were heavy, with 22,000 American casualties, 7,000 of them dead, almost 12% of their numbers. I've seen higher figures in other sources, and almost the entire Japanese force was also killed, as well as a large number of the native Okinawans, including those who had been conscripted by the Japanese military, many of whom committed suicide. Most of the 7,000 prisoners were Okinawans. 26,000 of the American troops were recorded as non-battle casualties, most suffering from combat fatigue. Speedy psychiatric treatment rehabilitating most of them, although 20% were afterwards reassigned to non-combat roles. The landings were heavily supported by both the American and British Commonwealth navies, which were heavily attacked by Japanese suicide planes and bombs, the kamikaze or heavenly wind, with 1,900 Japanese pilots sinking 25 ships, in addition to damaging others. The British ships, we may note, with their steel flight decks, were more resilient than the American wooden ones. There were also attacks by newly hastily trained conventional pilots. The kamikaze attacks obviously declined in number as the volunteers died. At this point, the Americans were considering what their final strategy should be for the defeat of Japan. Given the fierceness of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the American chiefs of staff carefully considered its options for the final defeat of Japan, deciding to launch a massive invasion of the island of Kyushu in November 1945, followed by a joint Allied attack on Honshu in March 1946, an unconditional surrender then being imposed amid the ruins of Tokyo. Stalin promised that the Soviet Union would also invade Manchuria and northern China beginning in August 1945, thus tying up the Japanese forces there. The American Air Force declared that it could defeat Japan by itself through intensive bombing by October 1945, but neither the American Army or Navy chiefs found this claim credible. 4 major modifications to original ideas for the defeat of Japan were made during 1945. First, nationalist China had come to be seen as too weak to make a major contribution to the final result. Secondly, the British campaign in Burma now was seen as a sideshow, which would not contribute to the defeat of Japan, but would help the British to re-establish their empire in Southeast Asia. Thirdly, the potential Soviet contribution had come to matter more, although after the taking of Okinawa, the American Navy and the US Air Force dominated Japanese home waters and could prevent any reinforcements being sent from China and Manchuria, so the defeat of the Kwangtung Army was no longer a prior condition for the invasion of the home islands. And finally, there was the Manhattan Project to build and explode atomic weapons. This we'll discuss in the next video. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you in particular to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. As always, you're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment and share. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about the Manhattan Project and the bomb, which is the final section of this chapter. Have a good day.